Oberfeldwebel Karl Brenner pressed his face against the narrow firing slit of his concrete pillbox, squinting through the swirling dust and smoke toward the British lines. 3 miles inland from Sword Beach, June 7, 1944. 1,430 hours. His machine gunner had just forced back another British infantry probe, the third that morning, and Brenner allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The bunker was perfect, walls 1 meter thick, reinforced steel bars running through the concrete like bones through muscle, firing slits positioned to create overlapping fields of fire with the adjacent positions. Ammunition stored sufficient for days of sustained combat. This pillbox had stood for 18 months, turning back every assault, surviving every bombardment. The British had been ashore barely 30 hours, and Brenner was confident his fortress would stop them just as it had stopped everything else. Then he saw it. A British tank was moving forward through the rubble of the village, but something was wrong with it. Where the main gun should be, where every proper tank mounted an elegant barrel extending meters beyond the turret, there was only a stubby tube, short, wide, barely longer than the turret itself. It looked like someone had cut off the real gun and welded a piece of industrial piping in its place as a joke. "What is that?" one of Brenner's gunners asked, squinting through his own firing slit. "A dustbin," another replied, and the bunker erupted in laughter. That's exactly what it looked like. Some British engineer had apparently mounted a trash can on a tank turret. The proportions were absurd, comical even. The thing looked less like a weapon, and more like someone's failed metalworking project. The tank stopped approximately 80 meters away, close enough for Brenner to see every detail of the peculiar weapon. The turret rotated slowly, deliberately, aligning the stubby tube directly at their bunker. The laughter died in Brenner's throat. There was a sound, not the sharp crack of a tank gun, but a deep, hollow thump, like someone striking an enormous drum with a mallet. Brenner saw something arc through the air. It moved slowly enough to track visually, tumbling awkwardly end over end, clearly visible as a large cylindrical object that looked exactly like what his gunner called it, a flying dustbin. Time seemed to compress. The object grew larger. Brenner's brain screamed at him to move, but there was nowhere to go in a confined bunker. The cylinder struck the front wall, just left of the main firing slit. The explosion wasn't like anything Brenner had experienced before. Not like artillery, not like tank fire, not like anything in his 3 years of combat. It was deeper, heavier, more fundamental. The blast wave didn't just impact the surface. It traveled to the concrete structure itself, like a shock wave through water. The entire front wall collapsed inward. 1 meter of reinforced concrete, designed to withstand direct artillery hits, reduced to rubble and dust in less than a second. The firing slit disappeared. The machine gun position disintegrated. Brenner was thrown backward by forces he couldn't comprehend, his ears ringing, temporarily blinded by dust and debris. When he could see again, most of his bunker no longer existed. The front wall was gone. The roof was partially collapsed. 3 of his men, the ones who'd been laughing seconds earlier, were buried in rubble or dead. The fortress that had protected them for 18 months had been destroyed by a single shot from a weapon that looked like a crude joke. Brenner crawled through the wreckage, surrendering to British infantry, who approached with weapons ready. One British soldier gestured at the destroyed bunker and said something in English that Brenner didn't understand. But the meaning was clear from the man's expression. That's what happens when you laugh at the dustbin. The tank that had destroyed his position sat motionless 80 meters away, its stubby weapon already traversing toward the next bunker. Brenner had thought it looked ridiculous. He understood now that it was the most terrifying thing he'd seen in the entire war, a weapon designed specifically to erase fortifications, and one that worked exactly as intended. This is the story of Britain's most unusual weapon of World War II, the weapon Germany mocked until it destroyed everything they'd built. To understand why Britain developed a tank that fired flying dustbins, you need to understand a problem that conventional weapons couldn't solve. How do you destroy a fortress when you're in the middle of attacking it? By 1943, German defensive doctrine had evolved into something brutally efficient. Everywhere Allied forces advanced, North Africa, Italy, northwestern Europe, they encountered the same tactical nightmare. Reinforced concrete bunkers positioned to create overlapping fields of fire, walls over 1 meter thick, designed specifically to withstand direct artillery hits. The Atlantic Wall represented the culmination of this approach. Thousands of fortified positions covering potential invasion beaches, each bunker positioned to provide mutual support, creating interlocking kill zones that would devastate any assault force attempting to advance. German engineers had learned from 3 years of warfare exactly how to build fortifications that conventional weapons couldn't eliminate efficiently. British tank guns, even relatively powerful 17-pounder weapons mounted on Sherman Fireflies, were designed primarily for engaging armored vehicles. Against concrete fortifications, they achieved minimal effect. A 17-pound armor-piercing shell would penetrate tank armor efficiently, but would merely chip concrete when fired at bunkers. High explosive shells were more effective, but still required multiple hits to achieve significant damage, and German bunkers were specifically designed to survive such bombardment. Artillery could destroy fortifications given sufficient time and ammunition. A sustained barrage from field artillery would eventually reduce most bunkers to rubble, but artillery required extensive preparation, consumed enormous quantities of ammunition, and wasn't always available when assault forces needed immediate support. Infantry attacking fortified positions couldn't wait hours for artillery preparation. They needed bunkers eliminated immediately, during the assault itself, at the moment when delay meant casualties piling up in killing zones. Every minute spent waiting for artillery meant more men die in the open, while German machine gunners fired from safety behind reinforced concrete. Air strikes were similarly problematic. Bombing fortified positions achieved results when bombers could deliver ordnance accurately, but close air support was unreliable due to weather, coordination difficulties, and the risk of hitting friendly forces. Infantry couldn't depend on air support being available at the critical moment when they needed specific bunkers destroyed to continue their advance. The tactical problem was straightforward but seemingly impossible to solve. Assault forces needed a weapon that could destroy fortified positions immediately, without waiting for artillery preparation or air support, using a platform that could accompany infantry during the assault and eliminate bunkers on demand. The weapon needed to be mobile, protected against small arms fire, capable of delivering explosive power sufficient to collapse reinforced concrete structures, and able to engage targets at the point-blank ranges where infantry combat occurred. Everything Britain tried had failed. Standard tank guns couldn't generate sufficient blast effect. Flamethrowers could clear bunkers but required extremely close approach and couldn't destroy the structures themselves. Demolition charges placed by infantry engineers worked, but required soldiers to approach fortifications directly under fire, a task that resulted in catastrophic casualties. The solution Britain eventually developed was so unconventional that both British troops and German defenders initially questioned whether it was serious military equipment or some kind of improvised field modification gone wrong. They called it the petard, and it looked absolutely ridiculous. The petard represented a fundamentally different approach to bunker destruction compared to conventional weapons. Rather than attempting to penetrate fortifications through kinetic energy or shape charges, the petard delivered massive explosive charges that destroyed structures through pure blast effect. The weapon was technically a spigot mortar, a launching system where the projectile contained a propellant charge and fired from a fixed rod rather than from inside a gun barrel. This design allowed for projectiles far larger than conventional guns could fire, since the projectile diameter wasn't constrained by barrel dimensions. The petard's projectile was a cylinder 26 centimeters in diameter, containing 18 kilograms of high explosive, roughly equivalent to a large artillery shell or naval depth charge, wrapped in a package that looked exactly like what soldiers immediately started calling it, the 40-pound flying dustbin. The weapon replaced the main gun on Churchill tanks that were converted to AVRE, Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers, configuration, where a normal tank turret mounted a gun barrel 2 or 3 meters long. The petard installation was barely 1 meter, a stubby tube that protruded just beyond the turret face. The visual effect was exactly what German observers noted. It looked like someone had replaced a proper tank gun with industrial equipment that didn't belong on a combat vehicle. It looked crude, improvised, almost comical. British tank crews loved it. German defenders laughed at it, until they saw what it did. The firing mechanism was simple and robust. The projectile was loaded onto a spigot rod inside the mortar tube. Firing ignited the propellant charge in projectile's base, launching the bomb with a distinctive deep thump that was immediately recognizable to anyone who'd heard it before. The projectile arced through the air slowly enough to be visible in flight. Troops on both sides could literally watch the flying dustbin tumble toward its target and detonate it on impact with whatever hit. The effective range was approximately 80 to 100 meters. Beyond that distance, accuracy degraded rapidly, and the arcing trajectory made hitting specific targets difficult. This limitation was deliberate. The weapon was designed for point-blank assault work, where the aviary would drive directly toward fortified positions and engage them at ranges where missing was nearly impossible. The reload process was the system's most distinctive and terrifying feature. Unlike conventional tank guns that loaded from inside the turret, the petard required external reload. A crew member had to open the turret hatch, lean out of the tank while exposed to enemy fire, manually load the massive cylindrical projectile onto the spigot rod, and close the hatch before the weapon could fire again. The entire process required approximately 2 minutes under combat conditions, during which time the tank was vulnerable and the crew member conducting the reload was completely exposed to any German soldier with a rifle and decent aim. British engineers recognized this vulnerability but concluded it was acceptable given the weapon's tactical role. AVREs weren't meant to engage in sustained combat. They advanced with assault forces, destroyed specific high-value targets like bunkers or fortified buildings, and then withdrew while conventional tanks provided ongoing fire support. The slow reload rate was less important than the weapon's ability to eliminate fortifications that nothing else could destroy efficiently. And when British planners calculated the trade-offs, the math was overwhelming in the petard's favor. The petard's effectiveness against fortifications came from delivering concentrated explosive force against structures that were strong in some directions but relatively weak in others. Reinforced concrete fortifications were designed to resist penetration from the front, the direction from which enemy fire would typically arrive. German bunkers had frontal armor that could withstand direct hits from artillery shells, with walls 1 meter thick and reinforced with steel bars embedded in the concrete matrix. This construction made them nearly immune to conventional tank guns and difficult to destroy even with sustained artillery bombardment. But concrete structures were vulnerable to blast over pressure that traveled to the material itself rather than attempting to penetrate from outside. When a petard's 18-kilogram warhead detonated against a bunker wall, the explosion created a shock wave that propagated through the concrete, causing internal fracturing and structural failure. The reinforcement bars that strengthened the concrete against penetration couldn't prevent this blast effect. The entire wall would fail as the concrete fractured under forces that exceeded its structural limits. Roofs collapsed, firing slits disintegrated. Bunkers that had been designed to survive sustained bombardment simply ceased to exist. The tactical advantage was overwhelming. A single petard round could destroy bunkers that would require dozens of conventional tank gun rounds or sustained artillery bombardment to eliminate. The efficiency calculation favored the petard decisively. One aviary with approximately 30 flying dustbin rounds could destroy more fortifications in an assault than an entire battery of field artillery firing for hours. The psychological effect was equally significant. German troops defending fortified positions understood that concrete walls provided protection against most weapons. Bunkers were supposed to be safe places where defenders could fight from cover, protected against small arms, resistant to artillery. The petard violated that assumption completely. When a flying dustbin hit a bunker, the structure simply ceased to exist. Walls collapsed, roofs caved in, firing positions disintegrated. Defenders inside were buried in rubble or killed by the blast wave traveling through the structure. German soldiers learned quickly. When aviaries appeared, remaining inside bunkers meant certain death. The fortifications that were supposed to protect them became traps that ensured they'd be killed when the petard round arrived. This realization fundamentally changed defensive tactics. Troops began abandoning bunkers when aviaries approached, preferring to take their chances in the open rather than waiting to be buried alive when their position collapsed around them. The weapon Germany mocked had become the weapon Germany feared most. If you're amazed by how Britain turned a dustbin into the most feared bunker buster of World War II, hit that subscribe button right now. We're about to cover D-Day, where this ridiculous-looking weapon proved its worth by destroying the Atlantic Wall faster than anyone thought possible. You won't want to miss what happens next. June 6, 1944 provided the first large-scale combat test of aviary capabilities, and the results validated the concept decisively. The Atlantic Wall fortifications covering Normandy beaches represented exactly the kind of defensive positions the aviary had been designed to defeat. Concrete bunkers with interlocking fields of fire, positioned to devastate landing forces, protected by minefields and obstacles that would channel attackers into predetermined killing zones. German commanders were confident these defenses would inflict catastrophic casualties on any invasion force, buying time for reinforcements to arrive, and potentially throw an invasion back into the sea. They hadn't counted on the flying dustbin. British assault forces included specialized armor units, the 79th Armored Division's funnies, that deployed various modified tanks for specific tactical roles. Among these were aviaries equipped with petard mortars, tasked with eliminating fortified positions that would otherwise halt the advance off the beaches. The aviaries went ashore in the first waves, advancing with infantry toward the fortified positions covering the beach exits. German defenders opened fire from bunkers that had been positioned to provide interlocking coverage, creating fields of fire that conventional assault methods couldn't penetrate without massive casualties. The aviaries identified priority targets, bunkers blocking critical routes, positions that threatened advancing infantry, fortifications that artillery couldn't suppress effectively. At distances that ranged from 60 to 100 meters, the aviaries fired their petard mortars. The flying dustbins arced toward their targets with trajectories that were visible to both attackers and defenders, tumbling through the air before impacting bunker walls with explosions that German troops later described as feeling like earthquakes. Bunkers that had been designed to withstand prolonged bombardment collapsed from single hits. Firing slits disappeared as walls fractured and caved inward. Positions that would have required extensive artillery preparation or prolonged infantry assault were eliminated in seconds. The tactical impact was immediate and profound. Beach exits that German defenders expected to hold for hours were cleared in minutes. Infantry that would have been pinned down by bunker fire advanced rapidly behind aviaries that eliminated strong points systematically. The Atlantic Wall fortifications that were supposed to make invasion impossible proved vulnerable to weapons that delivered blast effects conventional guns couldn't match. One British after-action report noted, aviaries proved invaluable in reducing fortified positions. Bunkers that resisted conventional tank fire and required extensive artillery preparation were destroyed with single petard rounds. The weapon's psychological effect on enemy troops was substantial. Defenders frequently abandoned positions when aviaries approached rather than waiting to be engaged. Recommend increased aviary allocation for future assault operations. German reports were more blunt. One regimental commander reported, British engineer tanks mounting large-caliber demolition weapons destroyed our strongest positions with single shots. Concrete fortifications that were designed to withstand sustained bombardment collapsed instantly when struck by these weapons. Defensive positions became death traps rather than protection. Troops increasingly refused to remain in bunkers when these tanks approached. The weapon they'd mocked had shattered the Atlantic Wall. German forces developed specific recognition procedures for aviary threats and attempted various countermeasures, none of which proved particularly effective. Initial encounters generated reports that German intelligence analysts found difficult to credit. Frontline units described British tanks mounting unusual weapons that destroyed fortifications with single shots, but the description seemed exaggerated or confused. How could a tank-mounted weapon destroy reinforced concrete bunkers more effectively than artillery? The claim seemed implausible, until sufficient evidence accumulated that the reports were accurate. Once German commanders recognized the aviary as a distinct threat, they attempted to develop countermeasures. The obvious approach was destroying aviaries before they could engage fortifications. Anti-tank guns were positioned to cover approaches to defensive positions, with orders to prioritize any tanks displaying the characteristic stubby mortar tube. But aviaries typically advance with infantry and supporting armor, making it difficult to engage them selectively. Destroying one aviary often required exposing anti-tank positions to fire from multiple British tanks, resulting in losses that German forces couldn't sustain. Some units attempted to concentrate fire on aviaries during their vulnerable reload period, when crew members were exposed outside the turret. This achieved occasional successes. Aviaries were lost to small arms fire or artillery during reload, but didn't significantly reduce the weapon's effectiveness. Aviary crews learned to conduct reloads behind cover or while protected by smoke, making them difficult targets even when exposed. German troops developed an informal doctrine of evacuating bunkers when aviaries appeared. Orders typically specified that defenders should maintain positions under normal circumstances, but when British engineer tanks approached, troops were authorized to withdraw rather than remaining in fortifications that would likely collapse on them. This represented a tacit admission that fortified positions offered no protection against petard rounds, and that troop survival depended on avoiding engagement rather than attempting to defend fixed positions. One German company commander reported, "Remaining in concrete bunkers when British demolition tanks approach is suicidal. The weapons they employ destroy our strongest positions instantly. Troops understand this and increasingly refuse to remain in bunkers when these tanks are present. Fortifications that were intended to protect our forces have become traps that ensure casualties if occupied when attacked. Recommend withdrawal from fixed positions when British engineer tanks are identified, even though this violates defensive doctrine." The assessment represented a fundamental failure of German defensive strategy. The Atlantic Wall and subsequent defensive lines had been constructed around the assumption that fortifications would protect defenders, allow them to inflict disproportionate casualties on attackers, and enable outnumbered forces to hold positions against larger enemy formations. Aviaries violated every element of this calculation. Fortifications didn't protect defenders. They created confined spaces where troops would be killed when structures collapsed. Casualties were disproportionate, but in the wrong direction. Defenders died while attackers survived. Small forces couldn't hold positions against larger formations when their fortifications could be systematically destroyed in seconds. The weapon they'd laughed at had rendered their entire defensive strategy obsolete. The aviary's success on D-Day led to expanded deployment throughout the Northwest Europe campaign. As Allied forces advanced through France, Belgium, and into Germany itself, they encountered increasingly sophisticated fortifications. But the flying dustbin proved equally effective against all of them. During the assault on fortified cities like Caen and Aachen, aviaries systematically destroyed urban fortifications that would have required weeks of siege warfare to reduce through conventional methods. German troops defending cities learned the same lesson their comrades had learned on the beaches. When the dustbin guns arrived, staying in fortified positions meant death. The Siegfried Line, Germany's western defensive fortification network, included bunkers even more heavily reinforced than those of the Atlantic Wall. German engineers were confident these positions would delay Allied advance for months. Aviaries broke through in days. One German officer, captured after his bunker was destroyed by a petard round, was asked about the weapon's effectiveness. His response was translated as, "We built these fortresses to last forever. Your dustbin gun destroys them in seconds. There is no defense. The only option is to abandon positions before you arrive, but then we have no positions to defend. Your ridiculous weapon has made our strongest defenses worthless." The psychological warfare aspect became as important as the physical destruction. German intelligence distributed photographs and descriptions of aviaries to frontline units, warning them about the Rohrgeschütz tube gun that could destroy any fortification. But the warnings had an unintended effect. They convinced German troops that fortified positions offered no safety, undermining the confidence that made static defense possible. British forces exploited this ruthlessly. Even when aviaries weren't available, conventional tanks would advance toward German bunkers, and defenders would frequently abandon positions, believing the approaching tanks were aviaries. The mere possibility of facing a flying dustbin was enough to break defensive positions. As the war progressed, British engineers refined aviary tactics and developed variations on the basic concept. The reload problem remained the weapon's primary limitation, so crews developed elaborate procedures to minimize exposure during reload operations. Some aviaries carried infantry squads whose specific job was to provide covering fire during reload, suppressing any German positions that might target the exposed loader. Other aviaries worked in pairs, with one vehicle providing suppressive fire while the other reloaded. Smoke became standard procedure. Aviaries would fire smoke rounds before engaging targets, obscuring themselves during the vulnerable reload period. This reduced reload casualties significantly, but also meant that aviaries fired more blind during sustained engagements. The weapon's accuracy improved through experience rather than technical modification. Crews learned to account for wind, distance, and target characteristics. Expert aviary gunners could consistently hit specific portions of bunkers, aiming for structural weak points or openings that would maximize blast effect inside the fortification. By late 1944, experienced aviary crews were achieving first-round kill rates exceeding 80% against fortified positions. The weapon that had started as an improvised solution to an impossible problem had become a precision instrument of bunker destruction. After the war, British and Allied military analysts conducted comprehensive reviews of weapons' effectiveness. The aviary and its petard mortar received special attention due to their unconventional design and spectacular combat results. The assessment concluded that the petard had been one of the most cost-effective weapon systems of the entire war. Each aviary cost approximately the same as 2 standard tanks to produce and operate. But in combat, a single aviary could eliminate fortifications that would have required an entire artillery battery, costing many times more, firing for hours and consuming thousands of rounds of ammunition. The casualty prevention calculation was even more striking. Infantry assaults on fortified positions typically resulted in casualties exceeding 50% of attacking forces. Aviary support reduced assault casualties to less than 10% in most operations. Over the course of the Northwest Europe campaign, analysts estimated that aviaries prevented approximately 15,000 Allied casualties that would have occurred during conventional bunker assaults. German military analysts, interrogated after the war, provided their perspective. One German general stated, "The British dustbin gun, we called it that because it looked ridiculous, was more effective at breaking defensive lines than any other weapon system you employed. It destroyed our fortifications faster than we could build them. It eliminated our strongest positions without requiring the extensive preparation that artillery or air strikes needed. And it created terror among troops who understood that concrete walls offered no protection. If we had possessed such a weapon, the Normandy invasion would have failed." The technical concept influenced post-war weapon development. The principle of delivering large explosive charges via short-range mortars appeared in various Cold War-era demolition systems. The Israeli military developed similar weapons for urban warfare. Modern thermobaric weapons employ the same basic concept. Maximum blast effect delivered at point-blank range against structures that conventional weapons can't efficiently destroy. The aviary's effectiveness depended not just on technical capability, but on the extraordinary courage of the crews who operated them. Loading petard under fire required exposing oneself completely to enemy fire. Driving an aviary toward fortified positions meant advancing into concentrated fire from defensive positions specifically designed to destroy approaching tanks. This alone accounted for numerous crew deaths. Loaders shot by snipers, killed by artillery, wounded by small arms fire. Tank commanders faced similar risks, needing to expose themselves to identify targets and direct fire accurately. One aviary commander, interviewed after the war, described the experience. Driving toward German bunker, knowing they're watching you approach, knowing they're firing everything they have at you, knowing you need to get within 80 meters before you can engage, it required forcing yourself forward when every instinct screamed to stop or reverse. Then conducting reload while exposed, with Germans shooting at you. That required something beyond normal courage. We lost good men doing that. But we also saved thousands of infantry who would have died assaulting those bunkers conventionally. British military records show that aviary crews received a disproportionate number of decorations for valor. The combination of technical skill, tactical judgment, and physical courage required to operate the weapons effectively marked aviary crews as elite specialists. German accounts confirm this assessment. One German machine gunner stated, "We watched British engineered tanks approach our positions. We knew what they would do. We fired everything we had at them. Sometimes we could stop them, but they kept coming, and when they reached firing range, our bunkers were destroyed. The men operating those tanks had courage we respected, even as we feared what they could do to our positions. They mocked it, the stubby tube that replaced the proper gun barrel, the flying dustbin that tumbled through the air, the weapon that looked like industrial equipment accidentally welded to a tank turret. German soldiers laughed when they first saw it. British troops made jokes about fighting with trash cans. Then the first petard round hit a bunker, and the laughter stopped. Germany spent years building the Atlantic Wall, thousands of fortified positions, reinforced concrete designed to withstand artillery bombardment, interlocking fields of fire that would devastate any assault force. The strongest offensive line ever constructed, meant to make invasion impossible. Britain's ridiculous dustbin gun broke through in hours. Bunkers that were designed to survive sustained bombardment collapsed from single hits. Fortifications that should have held for days were eliminated in seconds. Defensive positions that represented years of engineering work were reduced to rubble by weapons that looked like jokes. The petard proved that sometimes the most effective weapon is the one that ignores conventional wisdom completely. That solving impossible problems requires accepting solutions that look ridiculous. That what appears crude or improvised might actually be revolutionary. German soldiers learned to fear the distinctive thump of petard mortars firing. That sound meant their fortress was about to become their coffin. It meant the concrete walls that were supposed to protect them would collapse and bury them. It meant that staying in bunkers, the safest place on a battlefield according to every tactical manual, was the most dangerous choice they could make. The weapon they mocked became the weapon they feared most. The dustbin gun destroyed more fortifications than any other Allied weapon system. It prevented thousands of casualties that would have occurred during conventional bunker assaults. It broke defensive lines that should have held for months. All because British engineers looked at an impossible problem and decided that the solution might involve firing enormous cylinders of high explosive from a weapon that looked like it belonged in a junkyard rather than on a battlefield. Germany mocked the unusual British dustbin gun. Then it broke through their fortresses. Then it broke through their confidence. Then it broke through their entire defensive strategy. And the weapon that looked most ridiculous proved to be one of the most effective instruments of war ever devised. The lesson endures in military innovation today. Never judge a weapon by its appearance. Judge it by what happens when someone pulls the trigger. And in the case of petard, what happened was that the strongest fortifications ever built simply ceased to exist, destroyed by flying dustbins that turned mockery into terror and transformed ridiculous appearance into revolutionary capability. They laughed at the dustbin. Then their fortresses fell. Then they stopped laughing entirely.